event. Good evening, once again, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Alex Brubaker. I'm the manager here at the Scholar. And as always, I am live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at the bookstore. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We have a very special event tonight as we welcome Dr. Adam Rutherford to virtual Harrisburg. A couple things before we get started. If you have a question for Adam, please use the Q&A button below. It's below my face here. We love audience interaction for these, so your questions are important to making a fun and engaging live stream. So submit your questions at any point during the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many as possible later on. I'd also like to encourage you to purchase Adam's book through the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. It is titled How to Argue with a Racist, What Our Genes Do and Don't Tell Us About Human Difference. If you purchase the book through us, you'll also get a signed book plate thrown into the book from Adam. I'm going to drop the link to purchase the book in the chat room. So check out the chat room, click on the link, and you can purchase the book through our website. If you're on Facebook Live, look in the comments section, or simply head to our website at midtownscholar.com. But now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Adam Rutherford to our audience. Adam is a geneticist, science writer, and broadcaster. He studied genetics at University College London. And during his PhD on the developing eye, he was part of a team that identified the first known genetic cause of a form of childhood blindness. As well as writing for the science pages of The Guardian, he has written and presented many award-winning series and programs for the BBC, including the flagship weekly Radio 4 program Inside Science, The Cell for BBC4, and Playing God for the leading science series Horizon. He's the author of The Book of Humans and A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived. Our featured book this evening is, of course, once again, How to Argue with a Racist. Here it is. The Guardian writes that it is a fascinating debunking of racial pseudoscience, and The New Scientist writes that it smashes race myths that plague society. So again, if you'd like to purchase the book with a signed book plate, check out the link in the chat room or simply head to midtownscholar.com to get your copy. But now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming onto the screen Dr. Adam Rutherford.
Live? Yes. Okay, thank you, Alex. That was a very generous introduction there. I was at Midtown Scholar, what was it, 2 years ago when I was presenting The Book of Humans, or Humanimal as it was also titled. And what an amazing gem of a bookshop that is. Alex showed me around the basement, which is where you had the rare books collection, which is just absolutely amazing. So I'm really sorry I can't be there in person today, but I will be back as soon as I can. So Alex just said I'm a geneticist. That's exactly right. So that means that I deal in evolution and in DNA and in genes. And my work in the last few years, I'm just going to share my screen with you, has predominantly been about hold on just a sec, slight technical issue here. It's not sharing my screen, so let's try that again. Right. Hold on just a sec. So let me just try that again, like share screen, and there you go. There it is, it's sharing there, and there is the title screen. Okay, so yes, I was just saying that, so my work in the last few years has been primarily about race and about eugenics and the sort of quintessential role that science has played in the development of, well, the invention of race and the enactment of eugenics policies all over the world. So I wrote this book sort of unfortunately because I felt compelled to. I'm going to be talking about some fairly sensitive issues over the next half an hour or so before we get to the questions. But what it is that, you know, in the last few years, what I had found as a both working scientist, but also a science communicator, that sort of historical ideas about race and about human genetics, which are totally non-controversial within the academic genetics community, were not shared or not well known amongst the general public. And that as a result of the sort of changing landscape of global politics, race has become part of our public discourse now more than at any time in living memory. And science is a big part of that. So the book is written to equip people with the knowledge and with the arguments about the history of science, because the evolution of science itself is part of the construction of race as we currently recognize it. And it's also about cutting edge contemporary genetics, particularly because no other field has deconstructed the concept of race as comprehensively. So I'm going to be talking a little bit tonight about some of the core ideas in the book about overt and structural racisms, which means that focusing on key ideas about racial purity, and that means I'm going to be talking about white supremacists a little bit, but in many ways, they are a distraction from the real focus, which is that I'm sort of primarily concerned with things like racial stereotypes that non-racist people sometimes express, often about attributes which we consider to be complementary or positive, such as sporting prowess or intelligence. And it's kind of, the book is kind of for people who get into these sorts of discussions with family members or with friends in pubs or around Thanksgiving table or wherever, where they feel that they don't necessarily have the most contemporary scientific tools or an understanding of the history of science and the construction of race, so that they can confront these types of sort of background stereotypes, racialized mythologies. The book is also kind of for scientists, because I think that we need to lead these conversations. And I think historically scientists are not necessarily very good at talking about the politics that emerge from their research or from our field. But the fact is that if you are a geneticist like me and you talk about genomes and you talk about human variation, you cannot not talk about race. And the fact that it is a social construct and it is not rooted to a biological classification system as we now understand human variation via genetics in the 20th and the 21st century. So I mentioned that the political landscape has changed. These are some of the factors which sort of drove me to write this book, and why the discussions about race are back in the public discourse. We have this changing political atmosphere. We've had the rise of populism with the election of President Trump in your country, and here with a right-wing government, and the whole Brexit phenomenon. I love America. I love visiting. I was 2 years ago, I spent a couple of weeks there, and including visiting Harrisburg. I think this is the longest period I haven't been in America for all of my adult life. I find it kind of heartbreaking that conversations about race have become so prominent and so racialized, and that there is a racist in the White House, as indeed we have a racist Prime Minister in the UK Parliament. And the fact is, I don't need to tell you this, but the US has never quite managed to reconcile its racist past. And what we are seeing in the Black Lives Matter movements following on from the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, is a sort of frustration of structural and institutional racism that has spilled over, as it has done many, many times before the 2020 and indeed the 21st century. Now, again, science is part of that discourse, because it always has been. We've seen a huge growth and maturation of human genetics over the last 20 years. We just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Human Genome Project. And one of the great things about this is there's been matching popular interest in genetics, which is great for people like me, because this is what I want to talk about. Something that none of us predicted was the enormity and the rise of the commercial genetics market, so particularly relating to ancestry. And I take a pretty dim view about these companies or the products that they're selling, companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, and I'll be talking about that in just a minute. And then, of course, 2020 happened. So this book was published in the UK in February, so just before COVID-19 struck. I had about 6 weeks before lockdown in the UK occurred, and then I got COVID pretty seriously and was pretty seriously ill during that period. But COVID itself was massively part of the conversation about race that we are currently having. It was racialized instantaneously in two separate, distinct ways. The first was the origin of the virus itself in Wuhan in China. Now, we knew this was coming. I wrote in 2013 in a book that a pandemic was certainly coming, and I predicted that it was likely to come from East Asia and probably from a food market. This is one of the times when it's not rewarding when an apocalyptic prediction turns out to be right. But you'll know that the origin of this virus in China has meant that it's been racialized in that way. And again, I don't want to go on about Trump, but he does refer to it as the Chinese virus, which I know is technically correct. It came from China, and then references the Spanish flu. Actually, that is an incorrect reference. The Spanish flu is called that because during the First World War, Spain wasn't censoring its journalists. And so Spain was the first country to report on this new pandemic, when in fact we don't know the origin of the pandemic itself. But we think that it either came from Kansas, from a chicken farm, or possibly from France, but it certainly didn't come from Spain. There has been more than 3,000 physical violent attacks in America, in the USA, on Chinese Americans and Korean Americans, which obviously makes no sense, but then often racism doesn't. And it's happening all over the world as well. A kid from my own university was beaten in February on Oxford Street in central London. He was from Singapore. So that was one way in which COVID has been racialized. And the second way is that from around about March, we began to notice that in the UK, Black and Asian people were at a much greater risk of infection and death than white British people. And in the States, it was Black, Asian, and Hispanic or Latinx people who were also at higher risk of infection and death. Now, immediately, this was part of the racialization of COVID when lots of people started talking to me, and there were lots of articles in the press at this time suggesting that this was a demonstration of the biological reality of race, and that this disease was somehow targeting non-white Americans or British people in my country. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense anyway. All it served to do is to say that there are two groups of people. There are white people and that there are other people. And that doesn't even make any sense to most hardened racists, but people started putting forward proposals as to why this might be, and some of them are of some interest in a minor way. And I should point out that this version of the book that you've got in front of you is it is the American version. It has an extra introduction, a several thousand word introduction, which brings it up to date with COVID and with Black Lives Matters and more references in the full text. So it is a specifically US version of the book. Now, the fact that people tried to biologically racialize this disease, I think was very telling about how we think about race in the 21st century, because the truth of the matter is that by far easier and better explanations for the disparity, the racial disparity in people getting COVID and indeed dying from it, could all be explained by socioeconomic factors. So things like the fact that minority groups or non-whites tend to live in urban areas, they tend to live in multi-generational families with older people present who were more susceptible to infection anyway. They tend to have key worker status jobs, and so we're less likely to be able to lock down or be able to self-isolate. And so what we see is that the socioeconomic reasons that explain this disparity in the racialization of COVID infections is much, much better understood without even having to look at it, because it's not unique to COVID at all. Medicine is already racialized for exactly the same reasons down those socioeconomic lines. And yet, as soon as COVID happened, we were already beginning to talk about the racialization of the disease itself. So this is just a sort of background to where we are now. The world turned upside down in March, and we're still trying to work out how it's going to play out. I just want to, before I get stuck into the weeds about some of the content of the book, I just want to talk about a sort of overview. So the first thing is, there's only 4 chapters. It's a deliberately short book. It's about 45,000 words, 4 chapters, plus the introduction, the new introduction. And I talk about the origin of race because it's an invention from the 17th century during European expansionism. I talk about racial purity, which is a concept that is essential for some forms of racism, specifically white supremacy. And I talk about race and sport, because even though people aren't necessarily into sport, I love my sport. I think it's a really important sort of battleground for understanding and contesting some of the stereotypes that we associate with race. And then there's a chapter on race and intelligence, which is probably the most inflammatory and controversial subject in all of science. I'm not going to talk about that or the origin of race tonight, because they're both subjects which warrant whole lecture series on their own, but I will talk about racial purity and race in sport. Now, well-meaning people, non-racists, sometimes, because they've understood that race is not a biological categorization, but a social one, sometimes are tempted to say that race does not exist. And I think this is really important that we don't say this, because the fact of the matter is that race does exist. It exists as a social construct, not as a biological reality. Now, this is very important. Sometimes people attack this idea by saying, well, race exists merely. You're saying that race merely exists as a social construct, as if social constructs are less valid or less important than biological realities. That is an absurd argument to my mind, because almost all human interactions are socially moderated. Time is a social construct. Money is a social construct. But you don't get people saying, well, I'm not going to pay you because money is just a social construct. And yet somehow in arguments against the biological, for the biological reality of race, I should say, people sometimes say, well, it's just a social construct. It's really important that we recognize that race does exist because it's a social construct, and that is why it's important. Race exists because we perceive it. So this is a sort of part of the framework. I've said this in the past. I think a lot of well-intentioned people try to be so non-racist that they end up being potentially damaging some of the more sophisticated arguments, which I think should be part of this type of conversation. So let me talk about race in sports for the first bit, and then I'll talk about purity for the next bit, and then we can get on to the questions. So as I said, I think that sport is an important battleground for talking about race in the 21st century and indeed in the 20th century, because this is where we see people from around the rest of the world at extremes of ability in elite athletic status. And it's very easy to make judgments or make clumsy stereotypes, assessments of groups of people based on this. And again, this is often considered to be positive attributes racism. So, it was last week, it was the anniversary of one of the greatest events in American sporting history, and indeed in any sporting history, when Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals at the Berlin Olympics in 1936. This photo is in the book and is, to my mind, one of the most powerful photos in history. 1936 in Berlin, Hitler is watching this happen. He's watching all 4 medals being awarded to a Black American man. And this is wonderful. It feels like, this is an amazing moment in sporting history. It was massively undermined a few years later when Jesse Owens' coach was quoted by saying, "The Negro excels in the events he does because he is closer to the primitive than the white man." It wasn't long ago that his ability to sprint and jump was a life and death matter to him in the jungle. An unequivocally, scientifically illiterate and racist thing to say by Jesse Owens' own coach. Now, this was in the 1930s to the 1950s when Cromwell actually said this. And I think that in the modern era, overt racism like this has generally passed. We are less racist than we have been in the past, but it is still present, and it's still present in the way we talk about the physicality of Black athletes. Now, just to bring it up to date, or at least to the end of the 20th century, this is Michael Johnson winning the 200 meters in Atlanta in 1996. Johnson is my favorite athlete of all time. I just adored him when I was growing up, and I continue to adore him as he's become a sort of elder statesman of athletics, and indeed a commentator. Now, in the 2012 Olympics, which were here in London, just up the road, Johnson was a commentator. He was on the commentating team for the BBC. And in the run-up to the Olympics, there was a documentary about him and his life, during which they tracked some of his West African heritage via transatlantic slavery. And they did some genetic tests on him. This was 2012, so the tests weren't quite as mature as they are today. And with that, and in the program, he commented this. He said that all my life, I believed I became an athlete through my own determination, but it's impossible to think that being descended from slaves hasn't left an imprint through the generations. Difficult as it was to hear, slavery has benefited descendants like me. I believe there is a superior athletic gene within us. And I remember him saying this and me thinking, oh, that's kind of heartbreaking in a couple of ways for someone like me. The couple of ways being, well, I think it's tragic that someone as successful as Michael Johnson, one of the greatest athletes of all time, finds himself saying that his success is not actually through determination, that actually it is through inauspicious ancestry and this pernicious history that he is part of, simply for the fact that he is African American in the 20th century. But it was also interesting because to me as a geneticist, because this is a sort of testable idea. This is an argument that is worth scrutinizing and that we can actually try to understand from an evolutionary point of view and from a genetic point of view. And indeed, there does appear to be some genetic differences that we can detect now in the third decade of the 21st century, in comparing African Americans to Africans, to specifically West Africans, the people from whom the descendants of the enslaved were taken. And we see things like an increased frequency for some diseases, things like hypertension and some certain forms of cancer. We see a higher frequency of genes in African Americans for diseases such as sickle cell than we do in West Africans. But sickle cell is not a black disease, as it is sometimes mistakenly said. It is a disease that affects people whose ancestors evolved alongside malaria, because having two copies of the genes means you have the disease itself, but having one copy, sickle cell trait it's called, you are immune to malaria infection. So there is a higher proportion of sickle cell in African Americans, but it is not exclusive to African Americans, and it's not exclusive to Africans either. It is not a black disease. And we see similar sorts of effects when it comes to things like athleticism, when we begin to look at the genes associated with, for example, explosive energy success, which you would see in sprint running. We do see real differences between all people at elite levels of athleticism. Sport is definitely not a level playing field in that regard. And yes, Michael Johnson almost certainly has a genetic advantage over most humans. But is that unique to black people or African American people? No, it is not. So the question about whether his genetic advantage is as a result of slavery, the idea being that during 200 or 300 years of the slave trade in the Americas, that enslaved people were bred such that being strong or being fit was selected. Now, again, this is a scientifically testable idea, a hypothesis which we can actually look at. And 2 years ago, when 29,000 African Americans had their genomes scanned, not looking specifically for a superior athletic gene, as Michael Johnson speculated about, but just to see if there was any evidence of natural selection or artificial selection in the case of putative breeding programs. And the answer was, we didn't see any, right? We don't see any evidence of selection in either direction in the African American genome compared to the African genome from whom their ancestors were taken. And so we don't see this at all. There is no evidence for a superior athletic gene, and yet it is such a persistent myth and such a sort of pseudoscientific crutch that we find that even elite athletes begin to say things like this. So in a sense, we don't even need to get to the genetics of athleticism to undermine the sorts of ideas about sporting prowess and sporting success being biologically encoded, specifically in the descendants of the enslaved. Let's just sort of speculate generously for a minute here. Maybe selection is the biological difference, even though there is no evidence for it, for the overrepresentation of African Americans in various sporting events. Right, so let's just leave that out. Let's leave out the fact that 200 or 300 years is nowhere near enough time to see the kind of fixation of those types of genes in a population that would spread through an entire population. That also doesn't exist. Let's just deal with the social aspect of this. And let's just say, well, if there is a biological advantage in African Americans, even though we can't see any evidence for it, that doesn't in any way explain the discrepancy we see in different sports. So we do see dominance in short distance sprinting and explosive energy athletics of African Americans, but that should be able to translate into sort of powerlifting, where Eastern Europeans dominate and are completely absent in sprinting, or sports like squash, which is dominated by Egyptian people or Indians or even British people occasionally. You don't see any African Americans there. Why is it that African Americans dominate in boxing but not in wrestling? You know, so as soon as you scratch beneath the surface, you begin to see, well, this data set on which a really significant popular stereotype is based just falls apart after just the tiniest bit of scrutiny. If African Americans are biologically better at sprint athletics, track and field, why is there an absolute absence of them in short distance swimming, right? So all of these types of ideas, they do just fall apart as soon as you begin to take them apart. But they, at the same time, they're popular because they serve the narrative that is already baked into our culture about athleticism and the physicality of African Americans and the descendants of the enslaved. This is an example, this is a classic example of structural racism, which is built into our cultures. And I'm going to ruin for the sports fans some commentary now, because this was accounted for in a paper a couple of years ago by some sociologists who analyzed something like 3,000 comments in mainstream media about elite athletes. And what they found is that in the vast majority of cases when they were talking about elite athletes who were African American, then the commentators would refer to their physicality or their athleticism or their ancestry, right? And in the vast majority of cases where a white athlete was being referred to, in fact, the same proportion, the typical comments were about their industriousness and their intelligence and their hard work. So this, again, is structural racism whose roots are in the 17th and 18th century, when we're beginning European expansionism and the beginnings of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, that are so rooted in our culture in the 21st century that we still talk about the physicality of black men and the intelligence of white people. This is kind of the theme of the film that I think many of you have seen, Jordan Peele's film Get Out from a couple of years ago, the physicality of black people. Our culture very clearly says to us, black brawn and white brains. Now, I want to talk about one more sport briefly, because it's something I feel very passionate about, and that is swimming, which, as I mentioned a minute ago, is in complete contrast in the proportional representation of African Americans at elite level compared to running. So there is just effectively a complete absence of African American swimmers. In fact, there have been two in the whole history of the Olympics. So it's even, the disparity is even more significant in swimming than it is in track and field, but it's in the other direction. An almost complete absence, apart from these two swimmers, Cullen Jones and Simone Manuel. And this is reflected not just at the elite levels of sport, this is reflected through the whole of culture. You probably know this, but around about 70% of African Americans can't swim, compared to only 30% of European descended Americans who can't swim. Now, part of the stereotype and mythology of that disparity, the notion that black people don't swim, also comes from some terrible pseudoscience, which is to do with bone density. And there is a common myth, an urban myth, shared by many, many people, I'm sure some of you will have heard this, that black people's bones are more dense and therefore they have lower buoyancy than white people. And that accounts for the difference in why black people don't swim compared to white people. Now, it is as absurd as it sounds. It's drawn partially from some actuary data about osteoporosis, but let me just assure you that bone density makes no difference to whether people float, whether they're buoyant or not, and therefore whether they can swim. But it's so popular that many of my Black friends here in the UK have actually said this to me. It is an idea that has been bought into by the Black community, both in America and in the UK. And I find that quite tragic, because when a couple of years ago, when Swim America, this was 2008 in fact, so more than 10 years ago, Swim America tried to identify the most significant factors in why Black people are not represented in swimming at any level in the same ways that white people are. And they come out like this in reverse order. So an absence of role models, just like I was talking about in the Olympics there. Access to pools. So even after segregation ended in '64, officially, most pools were built in white areas. Economic reasons, so swim schools tend to be extracurricular, so there's a cost associated with them. And then there's having parents or friends who don't swim, so it's just generational, it just keeps going. People don't swim, therefore their children don't swim. But the number one reason that was identified for why Black people don't swim, and it seems crazy that I have to say this, is not being taught how to swim. No one is born a swimmer. There isn't an inherent biological mechanism by which people can either swim or they can't. The only people who can swim have been taught how to swim. And so I feel angry about this because, you know, people come up with this sort of crazy biological explanation for this, which makes no sense biologically or scientifically at all, when the easiest explanation is that you need to be taught to swim in order to swim. Now, it's almost funny, this, until you realize that for children between the ages of 8 and 14, the death rate from drowning in America is 3 times higher for African-American kids than it is for white kids. So this is an example of a structural racism which is not only baked into our culture, but it is literally lethal. The death rate is 3 times higher for Black kids than it is for white kids because of this. In this case, racism is literally lethal. Right. Now, I'm going to push on and just talk about the concept of racial purity just for the last 5 minutes or so, because this is an essential idea, as I mentioned at the beginning, for white supremacists. And although I don't want to focus on white supremacy or neo-Nazis in the book, it's impossible to ignore them as their discourse is expressed in social media and indeed in mainstream media more and more in the 21st century. Let me just show you a family tree. This is a standard family tree from a genetics manual, in which you have you at the bottom, there's 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. This is 7 generations back, so you have about 250 people in your family tree, that many generations back. This is standardized so that we can work genetic inheritance out on a tree like this, because of course family trees never actually look anything like this at all, because humans do 2 things very, very well. We move around and we have sex as much as we possibly can. So in fact, what happens is that our family trees expand from us as you go back through time, and they begin to collapse in on each other. This is a graphical representation of what we think that family trees look like more in genetic genealogy. And by the way, genealogy is the single most popular pastime in America, and it's the second most popular in the UK, where gardening is the top one. So there's a big difference between us. So what you see in this type of family tree, which is an accurate representation of generational time, is you at the bottom, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, but then you begin to see that the lines cross through individuals multiple times, like in the 4th generation back. And what this means is that you do have that number of ancestors. The number of ancestors you have doubles every time you go back a generation in time. But the number of individuals on those ancestral trees actually does not keep expanding. And this is obviously true because there are more people alive today than there are at any other point in history. And yet your family tree appears to show that you have more ancestors in the past than we do today. So what happens is our family trees go outwards from you, and then they begin to collapse in on each other. And the maths that emerges from this is that a concept called the identical ancestors point, or the ISA point. And this is when all branches of all family trees cross through all individuals. at exactly the same time. Now, I realize that, what is it, 6 o'clock over there, it's almost midnight here in London. But this is a completely head-scrambling concept, but it is absolutely true. Another way of saying it is, at the ISA point, if you have living descendants today, then they are the ancestors of everyone today. And you can see it on this chart, because by the time you get to about the 11th generation back, we count generations as about 25 years in genetics, the lines become so dense that you can't separate them out. And by the time you get 15 generations back, it is just a block. Every single line from you, and in fact from everyone in the population, crosses through every single individual by that sort of stage. Now, what that means is that we're descended from the same people many, many times over, and that humans are remarkably inbred as a species. Not dangerously so, but that's just the way we are. And how do I say that with such confidence? Well, you know, if we go back to the 10th century, which is when the ISA point for Europe was, that means that everyone alive in Europe in the 10th century is the ancestor of everyone alive in Europe today. And by Europe, I also extend that to American people descended from Europeans. So what that means is you can take a ruler such as William the Conqueror or Charlemagne the Great, the first Holy Roman Emperor, and we know that Charlemagne has living descendants today because his family tree is known, because he's royalty, but because we know he has family descendants alive today, that also means that he is the ancestor of literally everyone in Europe today. And that means that for all the white people watching this, he is your ancestor, your absolute direct, probably about 40 to 42 generations, your direct ancestor. So, you know, congratulations on that. You are descended from royalty, because everyone is. The ISA point for the whole of the world is something like 5,000 years ago. So what this means is, and why I'm telling you this, is it means that the concept of racial purity is a total, absolute myth. But of course, it is absolutely essential for white supremacists, because they've latched onto this idea that they are separate, that they have lineages which can't be polluted or can't be convoluted in the way that I'm saying is the actual reality of biology. And they've latched onto ancestry testing, so the sort of 23andMe's and the Ancestry.com type products, which some of you may have done, in order to demonstrate their racial purity. This is a classic example of misusing or misunderstanding or misrepresenting a science in order to justify a political ideology. So I spend quite a lot of time in racist discussion forums online, places like Stormfront or 4chan or 8chan when it was up. I seriously do not advise you to do this, because these are some of the most hateful places on earth. And I do it in order to monitor these conversations about racial purity, about genetics. And the frequency of conversations about genetics in Stormfront, for example, is absolutely enormous. It comes up in almost every discussion thread. Don't look, they're horrible, horrible places. I do it so that you don't have to do it. One of the tiny glints of sort of light in these otherwise terrible pits of despair is that with so many white supremacists and self-identifying neo-Nazis doing these genetic ancestry tests, occasionally their results come back and they contain recent ancestry from people who they despise, who they are obliged to hate. Here's an example from 4chan that I screen grabbed a few years ago now, because I've been tracking this since about 2012. But a couple of years ago, 2018, some sociologists, Aaron Panofsky, actually accounted for this in the first academic study of this exact phenomenon, where self-identifying white supremacists discover that they have recent non-Northern European ancestry in them. And they accounted for all the types of responses that followed these revelations. Now, the first thing I need to say is that none of the revelations were some kind of epiphany that racism was wrong or they changed their worldview about it. They were all ways of justifying or continuing to justify their racist beliefs that they already held. So these were the top, let me go down the list, top 5. The first most popular response was try another company for a different result. And I know that sounds ridiculous and it is quite comical. actually, this is the most scientific answer out of the ones that are going to follow, on the grounds that different companies use different genetic panels. So when you send your spit off and send you $100 or whatever it is, if you send it to a different company, you will get a slightly different result. So this one is not that absurd. However, they're going to get much worse very quickly. The next most popular is that 23andMe is run by Jews. You should try another company for a different result. After that, we're in proper conspiracy territory. 23andMe is run by Jews who plant false information to sow racial disharmony. Try another company for a different result. I don't really understand how or why Jewish people would want that or could do that, but we are well beyond rational arguments here. And then this is emblematic of some of the types of response. This is a direct quote from one particular response when a man discovered that he had recent Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, to which one of the responses was, look in the mirror, if you don't see a Jew, you're okay. Now I thought the absurdity of this is, well, it's so obvious, isn't it? What is the point in doing the test if you can simply decide that you don't have Jewish ancestry? So it's another classic example of usurping or misrepresenting science in order to justify a political ideology. And when the science doesn't even agree with the political ideology, you can just ignore it. At this point in the book, I quote Jonathan Swift, and I'll modernize the amazing thing he said in 1721, which is that you can't reason a person out of a position that they didn't reason themselves into. So the concept of the isopoints says something completely different from the white supremacist narrative about genealogy and about personal identity, which is that we are descended from multitudes. And we know that in the Americas even more, because African Americans have significant proportions of European ancestry, and pretty much all European descended Americans also have African American ancestry in them as well, as a result of 300 years of transatlantic slavery. And it is true that, people do move and have sex as often as they can. And sometimes they're big moves in short periods of time, but most people are sort of static over generational time, and certainly more so in history than today. And that can feel like a sort of cultural and geographical anchor. But the truth is that every Nazi has Jewish ancestors, and every white supremacist has Middle Eastern ancestors, and every racist has African or Indian and Chinese and Native American, Aboriginal Australian ancestors, because everyone does have the same ancestral pool after only a few generations back. 1,000 years ago, it is the entire population of Europe. 3,000 years ago, it is the entire population of the world. And when I say African, I don't just mean that, African, because we're an African species. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, and not just in our deep history, but I mean, from definitely after classical times and definitely into the modern era, racial purity is an absolute fantasy. So let me just wrap up. I just want to talk about Africa very briefly. We are an African species. We evolved in Africa over the last, from about 500,000 years ago, and around about 80,000 years ago, we emerged, or a very small proportion of people emerged out of Africa and began populating the rest of the world. But most of our evolution occurred in Africa, and the major proportion of people on Earth at this time, within the last 100,000 years, remained in Africa. And this is one of the migratory maps that we sort of broadly show how migration occurred over tens of thousands of years within the last quarter of a million years. But I prefer this one, which shows the genetic diversity of the people of Earth. So what that means is the differences between people that we see based on DNA rather than any other characteristic. And the land masses are scaled to represent this. And what it shows very clearly is that most of our evolution occurred in Africa. We are an African species. There is more genetic diversity within Africa than there is in the rest of the world put together. And that makes absolute sense. But the truth is that we haven't looked at the African genome at 1.2 billion people, 54 countries, until very, very recently, because just like society, science is also structurally racist. And it is structurally racist because it is part of society, not for any other reason. There's nothing special about science or the scientific method which either includes it or exempts it from the structural racism that we see in society. It is structurally racist because it is part of society and because scientists are part of society as well. And so therefore we need to look more around the rest of the world. And most of our genetics is based on Western Europeans. We need to truly understand human evolution by looking all around the world, and especially within our homeland, which is Africa. And people have begun to do this in the last few years. And some of the key results that have come from this is that there is more variation in pigmentation within Africa than in the rest of the world, which I mentioned in the beginning. And we know that there's more variation in pigmentation genes in Africa than in the rest of the world put together. And we also know that genes associated with both light and dark skin predate Homo sapiens by maybe 900,000 years, almost 1 million years. So skin variation, skin pigmentation, light and dark, has been part of our genesis since way, way before we were Homo sapiens. And we only know this because we've begun to look within Africa. Now, I'm going to finish right now, but just to wrap up, I want to say this. Science is an integral part of the development of race in the 18th, 19th century. But its trajectory is the thing we should celebrate, because it is genetics via anthropology is the one academic subject which has completely dissembled the biological concept of race in a way that no other academic or human endeavor has done. And race is real as a social construct. It is real because we perceive it. And racism is real because we enact it, but neither of them have a foundation in science. And my job and scientists' jobs and your job, if you want to read this book and get equipped, is to contest the bastardization of science, as has happened so often in history, to support a racist ideology. Basically what I'm saying is that you cannot have my tools to justify your bigotry. If you want to be a racist, that is fine. You have a fight on your hands from people like me and millions of others, but you cannot use my tools to justify your bigotry. Let me finish with a quote from Angela Davis, because I think that scientists have been too quiet for too long about this, and that science is a weapon in the contest against racism in the ways that I've described tonight and in the book. And her quote says this absolutely perfectly. In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. You have to be anti-racist. Thank you for listening. There you go, Alex, I've stopped sharing.
All right, thank you, Adam. Yeah, take a drink of water. We're gonna head to the audience Q&A now. So for our viewers out there, if you see the Q&A button, it should be below our faces here. Click that if you want to submit a question. We have some time here for a few questions. Also, check out the chat link or the chat room. You'll see a link for how to argue with a racist. Click on that link, head to our website, and you can purchase a copy of the book with a signed book plate. But to our audience members out there, get your questions in. We're going to start going through a few here. So this first question is from an audience member who said, during the discussion of Jesse Owens' coach's overtly racist statement, you said that we are generally less racist now than we were in the past. This person's wondering, how is something like that assessed? Are people just better at hiding their racism or embedding it into systems more sneakily, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a difficult one to answer. I attempt to answer it in the UK at the beginning of the book. When you survey people, when you ask people in questionnaires about racism, even if the surveys are anonymous, people tend to not give honest answers if they think that they're socially unacceptable. So even when they're anonymized, we don't think we get honest answers to questions like, are you a racist? And so the questions tend to be done by proxy. And so since 1983, in the UK, there has been a national attitude survey. And there's a sort of equivalent which is run by the Pew foundation for many years in the States. But let me just talk about the UK version. And in 1983, when the first time this was asked, the question was phrased like this: would you feel happy if your son and daughter was in a long-term relationship with a Black or Asian person? And when that question was asked in 1983, the results came back, and I forget the exact numbers, but it was something like 40% of people in the UK said they would not be at all happy if their son or daughter were in a long-term relationship with a Black or Asian person, right? Now, that is a racist viewpoint. When the question was asked in 2017 or 2018, that number had dropped to something like 15%. So by that metric, by that proxy question, the UK is less racist than it was 30 years ago. Now, in 2017, and this was the first time they asked this question, they also included the question, would you be happy if your son and daughter was in a long-term relationship with a Muslim? And the number came out at about 40% of people thought that they would be very unhappy with that. And so in a sense, what we see is that bigotry is permanent, but the types of bigotry are very fluid and they're very culturally determined. And anti-Islamic sentiment is very much more prevalent in the 21st century in the UK, and I guess in the US as well, than it was in the 1980s when I was growing up, when that type of racialized bigotry was focused specifically on Black British people. I think that the answer is pretty much the same. So just one final point to answer this question as well. The construction of race in the 17th, 18th century is a very real and non-controversial thing within history. It is not to say that there wasn't prejudice before that. It's just it never manifested itself in the specific ways that it has done for the last 200 or 300 years in the West, which is primarily initially determined by pigmentation. There's loads, in fact, more bigotry and prejudice in prehistory. It's just, it tends to be about things like culture, religion, language, accents, and this dates all the way back to, our oldest literature, from things like Homer, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and a couple of things that I mentioned in the very first chapter of the book.
I really like this next question. This person asks, when we hear someone make a statement that we recognize is racist, but the person doesn't see themselves as being racist, and they put in parentheses, oh, of course not. What has your research shown are some of the best, most effective ways to begin the challenging dialogue afterwards?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really important. And this is kind of why, I try not to focus on white supremacists too much, because, like I said, they're people who haven't reasoned themselves into these positions, and they're quite damaged in many ways. But it is the family members or friends who say things which you think, do you know what, I'm not sure, but I think that might be a little bit racist, and I now need the sort of gumption and tools to be able to answer this sensibly. The evidence very clearly suggests that local networks, close, friendly networks, including family, and this includes in social media as well, are by far the most effective ways of changing people's opinions about things. And so this is why these conversations need to be ignited at the dinner table, or in bars, or in coffee shops in Midtown Scholar. And they need to be non-aggressive as well, because we know very well from psychology as well that people tend to double down if you just come up to them and shout that you're wrong about that. So, I'm no diplomat. I'm a pugnacious kind of a guy. The title of the book is deliberately provocative. So you have to judge those situations where someone says something. But I think the answer is close relations, trusting relationships, and saying to people, I'm not sure that's right. And why don't we talk about that? Because I read this book the other day and blah, blah, blah. And actually it turns out that blah, blah, blah. I mean, I think sport is a good one because you can deconstruct those myths really easily. Music is another one that, it's another positive attribute where people say, well, Black people have got better rhythm than white people and they can dance better than white people. And who doesn't want to be a better musician or a better dancer? But again, what you're doing there is it's arguably not true. I talk about the difference between the success of Black artists in particular domains of music compared to complete absence in other domains of music. Is hip hop so fundamentally different from classical music that is genetically encoded? Of course not. But what they do is they reinforce the historical notion that, for example, in this case, Black people are not intellectually, they don't have intellectual prowess compared to Europeans. And this was sown by European white supremacists in the 17th and 18th century. So even though it feels like a positive attribute, the truth is you're just reinforcing structural racism, which is both untrue and is based upon the white supremacy of our past.
This next person asks, earlier in the talk you said modern genetics has done more to dismantle the race concept than any other branch of science. And this person just wants to know what your thoughts are on the field of anthropology over the last 4 or 5 decades.
Yeah, so anthropology is a very broad field, and in many ways, I'm guessing this person might be an anthropologist, and I hope that this wasn't a sort of microaggression towards anthropology as a discipline, which is a very honorable discipline. He says, backtracking as quickly as he can. The truth is that I'm sort of referring to the historical evolution of the subject that I'm part of and feel most passionately about, which is that effectively genetics emerged out of anthropology. And so anthropology in its broadest sense from the 17th century onwards is very closely tied to European colonialism. And it becomes, or a particular direction of anthropology becomes formalized as we get into the 19th and then into the 20th century. So anthropology itself in the 20th century, as many branches of science did, and I include genetics in that, some people within anthropology were somewhat responsible for reinforcing or trying to scienceify racial categorizations that had come before that. I think the reason I say that, I'm not saying that genetics is the best science, although it quite obviously is. The reason I say that so strongly about it being the one area that has dispelled race is because the ocean from which human variation can be drawn is our genomes. And it's only in the last 10 to 20 years that we've begun to understand our genomes and begun to look all over the world at our genomes, where you see what people are actually like at a molecular biology level, at a very, very basic level. And that's where the misalignment occurs. We're incredibly visual species. So we look at people and we say, you're a man or a woman, and you have dark skin or light skin, and we make all sorts of judgments based on these visual cues. But evolution has deceived us in that regard, because we categorize 1 billion African people as having dark skin and say they're Black, when in fact, as I said at the end, there's more variation in African pigmentation and African American pigmentation than in white pigmentation. So this is why I feel confident in rooting my anti-racist science in genetics rather than any other subject.
Adam, I know it's midnight over there, so we'll just wrap up with just a couple more questions and then we'll let you go.
Going for hours.
So this next person wants to elaborate on, not every racist we meet is going to be a white supremacist. They're talking about microaggressions. Yes. So death by 1,000 cuts, which happens to Black people all the time. Therefore, how do you approach or talk to these types of people? Microaggressions versus like very overt racist.
Yeah. I mean, that's super hard, because these types of things are just baked into our culture, and they relate to things I was saying about how, the comments about athletes and from media commentators and so on. These are types of things which are part of the everyday experience of any group that is racialized in this manner. And I mean, I think what I want to say about this is that this is my book is one of many that have begun to emerge in the last couple of years by other writers anticipating that our discourse about race has changed and is evolving and is becoming much more public. And I think the best way to answer this is to say that you just need to educate yourself and read. Mine, I think, is relatively unique in that it is it's one of very few, or possibly the only one, that approaches it from a scientific point of view, because that's what I do. And I'm not a race historian, I'm not a cultural historian, but the fact that the history of race is intrinsically intertwined with genetics and with anthropology and with the birth of science itself means that I can, I've got an angle in which to tackle it. But there are tons of other books which I thoroughly recommend, which are about the lived experience of people of color or people who are racialized. And I think the answer is we listen, right? You listen to people, you listen to what their experiences are, and don't assume and don't make the casual stereotypes. I was sitting in a car with a very prominent evolutionary biologist who some of you will have heard of one time. And as we stopped at a traffic light, this is in London, there was a group of black teenagers hanging around, doing what all teenagers do, and he locked the doors from the inside. And I thought, wow, you've just shown your cards there. You've just revealed something about your heart there. And I thought, yeah, that's where it is. Those are the sorts of inbuilt prejudices that we have to really forcibly confront in ourselves. And I think you do it by listening to people of color and educating yourself. And it starts with books.
We're going to end on this final question, which I think is really fitting. This is from Michelle. They say, they teach in a predominantly white school. How do you suggest we use your book's argument to open an anti-racist discourse in our classrooms?
Yeah. Well, learn your history is step one, because the history is it feels wildly different from now, but the same arguments are used historically as they are today, which is using science as a crutch to justify bigotry. And that's what I say at the beginning, and I say at the end of the book, that you can't have that, because that's not what the science actually says. There's a pretty good documentary that broadcast here a couple of months ago during lockdown, in which they tried to get school kids to confront their own inherent biases, their own built-in prejudices that they weren't necessarily aware of. And they did a very powerful demonstration of this, which is on the start line of a racetrack. All the kids were lined up, and the proportions were, I don't know, like 25% were black kids and maybe 75% were white kids. And then, they're not racist, they're kids. They're friends with the whole year group. And they said, right, we're going to do a race here. And before we start, though, we're just going to ask you a couple of questions. If anyone has been stopped by the police or knows anyone who's been stopped by the police, can you take a step backwards, right? And all of the black kids take a step backwards, and all the white kids stay in the same place. And they say, okay, now another question. If any of you have expressed any prejudice based on your skin color or based on your hair texture, right? And the black kids all take a step back and the white kids stay where they are. And what was really striking about this was the sort of weariness of the black kids doing this, because this is part of their lived experience, and the complete shock of the white kids who were standing there going, we had no idea. We didn't, seriously, this is, every single one of you knows someone or has been stopped by the police in random stop and searches, which is the policy that the current government has in the UK. And what was really interesting about that and transformative about watching that is it was the white kids going, wow, I just didn't realize that this is the lived experience. And I thought that was a very powerful demonstration. And so to I think it was Michelle, you said that clip is available online. I can't remember the exact title of it, but it was on Channel 4 in the UK. It was something like the school that fought racism or something. And it was such a powerful demonstration. I just recommend all teachers do that, watch it, and maybe try it.
All right, we've got to wrap up. I want to thank you again, Adam, for joining us virtually here. We really can't wait to see you in person once again in Harrisburg and have you visit the store. Thank you again, Adam. Thank you to our viewers for tuning in. The book, again, is How to Argue with a Racist. Check out the chat room. You'll see a link. Head to that link. Head to midtownscholar.com, and you can purchase the book. It'll include a signed book plate from Adam. But thank you again, Adam. I want to give you the last word to our audience.
Well, thank you for coming in. Like you say, I can't wait to come back to the States and see so many friends out there. And Midtown Scholar is, wow, it's the best bookshop that I went to in America. So that's super awesome. But, you know, just think about that Angela Davis. Think about that quote that if, you know, it's not good enough to be non-racist. I think we have to be anti-racist.
Thanks, Adam. Stay safe, everyone.